when you inhibit mTOR in the TORC2 complex, you actually get hyperlipidemia, hyperglycemia, and some evidence you actually decrease lifespan.
Welcome to Longevity Roadmap. I'm Buck Joffrey, and today's show is a very interesting one. It is an interview with Dr. Joan Mannick. Dr. Mannick is really, she is a very, very well-respected name in the longevity field. She really is a pioneer and working at the intersection of aging science and clinical medicine. And in this discussion, what we do is we really go through her journey into longevity medicine, including sort of her focus on mTOR, why she focused on that, and what she thinks the significance of mTOR is in the aging process. Now, you've heard of mTOR several times on this show, and we're going to continue to hear about it because, a lot of people, including I think Matt Caberline was on recently, believe that mTOR is one of the key proteins, one of the key pathways that needs to be addressed if we are going to continue down this pathway of trying to treat aging at the cellular level. Anyway, she is going to talk about some clinical trials she's done. You're going to see that it's not just a matter of longevity, but there's a lot of potential benefit for some of these mTOR inhibitors. The most commonly one, as you probably know, is rapamycin, but there's other mTOR inhibitors that she's working on that enhance immune response in older adults, and that has other implications as well. Anyway, fascinating interview. Make sure to listen, and if you like what you're hearing, make sure to subscribe and like and tell your friends. Hey, longevity enthusiasts, it's time to take it to the next level. I've been fine-tuning my longevity regimen for years, and I look better and feel better than I did a decade ago. In fact, my blood work is even better than it was back then. And it's all because of my data-driven regimen, and it's inspired me to create a course and community just for you. It's called the Longevity Roadmap, and I urge you to check it out. If you're tired of your belly fat, tired of being tired, or just want to optimize yourself for the next 50 years, visit longevityroadmap.com. That's longevityroadmap.com. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Today, my guest on Longevity Roadmap, she is a true pioneer at the intersection of aging science and clinical medicine. Dr. Joan Mannick. She's a physician scientist and biotech entrepreneur whose work has been instrumental in translating biology of aging into real-world therapeutics, with a career that started with an MD from Harvard and faculty roles both at Harvard and the University of Massachusetts. She then co-founded, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, but Restore Bio, where she led clinical trials on TORC1 and inhibitors like RTB101 to enhance immune function in older adults. And today she's continuing this work as CEO of Tornado Therapeutics, where she focused on creating next-generation mTOR inhibitors designed for safety and long-term use. Welcome, Dr. Mannick. How are you?
Oh, very well, and thanks for having me, Joffrey.
So I've been fascinated, even just listening to some of your podcasts. Obviously, you're a big contributor in this field, and part of what I'm curious about is kind of how you got into it, because you're an MD and you're obviously a physician scientist, but longevity medicine is something a little different. And when I was trying to understand that, I heard you talking about on another show, sort of an aha moment that you had with a paper from Cynthia Kenyon. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So you're right. I was a physician. I was an infectious disease attending, and I ran a basic science lab. And, as a typical lab person, I was reading, I think it was Nature, and just kind of flipping through it. And there was a article by Cynthia Kenyon where she talked about the fact if she mutated one gene in a worm, she was able to double the lifespan. And that was fine, it's a worm. But what she said in that paper was, what was the aha moment for me? She said, this shows that organisms have the potential to live much longer than they normally do. And that was such a novel concept to me because, I was always, as an infectious disease attending, I was always in the ICU and I was just trying
Yeah.
to get people to survive like the next week and the next 2 weeks and get them out of the ICU. And the idea that, what I'm doing is to extend, you know, stop death from happening in the next week. And she's talking about much longer lifespans was so interesting to me because it threw all our sort of medical education on its head. We were never taught, oh, certain interventions are going to make humans live much longer.
Yeah.
So just that sort of scientific turning how I thought about things on its head really intrigued me. And it wasn't about, oh, I want to make people immortal or I want to be immortal. It was more, are we missing? We're doing these little things. Are we missing the big things that science might be able to do to help people stay healthier longer or you live a good life? Like that have much more dramatic effects than anything that we're currently doing in medicine.
Yeah. And I would just add to that, like, you know, sometimes, even as a podcaster in this space, as a physician, people ask me, well, is this, I mean, what are you trying to do? You're trying to live forever. And the funny thing is, for me, it's as much of an intellectual thing as it is, yeah, sure, I would love to live longer and healthier and, see my grandkids and great grand. Sure, all that's true. But it's an absolutely mind blowing concept that you can, and in some regards, if you look at it in hindsight, it's like, why weren't we thinking like this before? Right? Like we've had species around us who live, hundreds of years longer than us. Why is that? And why are we sort of doomed to have sort of this pre-programmed, you know, 70 some year lifespan? And looking at that question, I think is absolutely fascinating. So yeah, that's great. You know, you and, some others, in the space I was like recently interviewed Matt Caberlin to have the real special interest in mTOR.
Mhm.
Um, what kind of drew you specifically to the mTOR pathway as a focus for aging related drug development? And maybe just before you kind of get too deep in that, maybe you could just remind people what mTOR is and thing.
Sure. So mTOR is the protein in cells that is the main responder to nutrients. So when you eat, mTOR is activated and it stimulates cell growth pathways. So every organism needs mTOR to grow and divide and reproduce. When you inhibit mTOR, which happens during periods of fasting, protective pathways get upregulated that sort of clean up the cell and quiet things down. So you should sort of have this circadian rhythm of mTOR being on during periods of the day you're eating, that's helping cells grow, and then off to sort of clean things up. And it turns out that biology that happens when mTOR is inhibited is quite good for us as we age. And this is, again, we don't know this for sure in humans, but this is in every other species where this has been looked at. If you inhibit mTOR in a yeast, a worm, a fly, a mouse, and now in a monkey, you extend lifespan. And this is remarkable because there's
Yeah.
thousands of proteins in each of these species. And then, higher up your species, the more proteins. Thousands and thousands of proteins. You inhibit one either genetically or with a drug called rapamycin, which is a very specific inhibitor of this protein, lifespan is extended. It's one out of thousands. That is one of those mind-boggling things. Why? Why? And because in the species where this has been examined, yeast to marmosets, this is billions of years of evolution. It's highly likely that inhibiting this one protein is going to have benefits for aging for humans as well.
Just for context on that, is mTOR the only one that has that kind of cross species data? I mean, when you go back to, I guess, the Cynthia Spencer or Cynthia Kenyon or I believe that was on IGF-1, right?
And what is downstream of that?
Yeah,
mTOR.
right. It's in the same pathway,
Exactly.
right?
It's same
Right.
pathway.
Yeah. Got it. Because in humans, that would be what the growth hormone pathway, right?
Right. Or the insulin growth factor, the
Yeah.
IGF pathway. It's all sort of these nutrient responsive pathways that signal downstream through this protein called mTOR.
So there's nothing else that we really know of that has that continuity across species. Is that fair?
Not yet that I'm aware of. I think there's lots of pathways that sort of intersect with mTOR that probably if you target these others, you'll get this kind of data set too. It's just there's been so much work done by many different labs, which is important because sometimes when something comes out of one lab, it can't be reproduced. But over and over in labs across the world, you either genetically inhibit this protein or you use this drug, rapamycin, and they get the same result. And that's very, you ask, why did I particularly like this? That validation in many labs, both genetically and pharmacologically, across species that are evolutionarily diverse, made me think this is really something we should test in a human.
Right. And just getting a little bit more in the weeds, there is a difference between a couple of the complexes for mTOR. There's TORC1, TORC2.
Mhm.
For those who are kind of interested in sort of the details of that, could you explain the importance of that distinction? Because
Sure.
I think as far as therapeutics, that becomes pretty important.
You're exactly right. So it's inhibiting. So mTOR signals in cells in two multi-protein complexes. One is called TORC1 and one is called TORC2. The rapamycin, this drug that has these lifespan extending effects, mainly inhibits mTOR in that TORC1 complex. But with chronic use, it can start inhibiting mTOR also in that TORC2 complex. And it turns out all the anti-aging effects of mTOR inhibitors and rapamycin and the genetic inhibition seems to be mediated by inhibiting mTOR in the TORC1 complex. When you inhibit mTOR in the TORC2 complex, you actually get hyperlipidemia, hyperglycemia, and some evidence you actually decrease lifespan. So an ideal mTOR inhibitor for extending lifespan is predicted to be one that selectively inhibits mTOR in that TORC1 complex.
Got it. And the TORC2 also is responsible, I think, for some side effects too. Is that right?
Yes,
Yeah.
it causes when you inhibit mTOR in the TORC2 complex, it causes hyperlipidemia and hyperglycemia, which are side effects of high doses of rapamycin.
Got it. Got it.
When you use low or intermittent doses of rapamycin, you can get it to not cause that hyperlipidemia and hyperglycemia. So it's
And of
dose
course,
dependent.
that explains why in the longevity community, people like, for example, me, are taking sort of a pulsatile approach. So not telling anybody to take this drug,
Mhm.
but I take, for example, somewhere between 6 and 8 milligrams one time per week. And again, the concept there is it's enough to stimulate mTOR, the TORC1 complex, but to kind of skim away from the TORC2 problem, right? Now, are some of the medications and stuff that you guys are looking at sort of more specifically targeting TORC1, so you don't necessarily have to, you know, kind of plan for that, avoiding it through pharmacokinetics?
Yeah. So Tornado, when I was at Novartis, which was before even Respiratory you mentioned, I was on a team that was developing new mTOR inhibitors for aging-related conditions. And they had their best rapalogs chemists working on this because rapalogs are complicated structures, difficult to make. The patent space is really crowded because mTOR inhibitors have been made for decades for organ transplant and cancer indications. But anyway, this team came up with this portfolio of new rapamycin-like molecules, rapalogs, that are many of them, the majority are TORC1 selective. They don't inhibit TORC2 at the highest doses they could test. So these are exciting because these are predicted to give us more ability to dose even higher in humans who have aging-related conditions without getting the side effects of TORC2 inhibition. So they are predicted, and we have to prove this in humans, they're going to be safer than rapamycin, but should still have the same anti-aging effects.
One of the things that I find somewhat confusing about mTOR physiology is that, I see we're hearing that mTOR inhibition promotes longevity pretty much across species. But then when you think about the things that actually raise mTOR activation in humans, one of the major things that will actually increase that activity is building muscle.
Right.
And we know that lean muscle mass is one of the leading indicators of longevity. So how should we reconcile this? Is it partially when we're inhibiting this, is there a tissue specific targeting mechanism, or how do we avoid building muscle if we're inhibiting mTOR?
That's a great question. So it's true. There's interesting things about inhibiting mTOR in muscle. It doesn't inhibit basal protein synthesis in muscle, but it will inhibit like amino acid stimulated protein synthesis and probably exercise-induced protein synthesis. So in young people, probably not a good idea. You probably don't need to be taking an mTOR inhibitor because you want your muscles to build.
Yeah.
The problem as we get older, that has been shown in animals and now in humans, is that mTOR gets hyperactive and it stops responding to fasting and it stays on all the time. So you don't get those periods where it's on and you're building proteins for your muscle and then it's off and it's helping repair pathways turn on. So the idea as we get older is we need to turn that hyperactive mTOR down to young levels and also kind of get back that part of the time it's on, part of the time it's off, circadian rhythm almost that younger organisms have. Instead of having it on all the time, turn it off some of the time.
But let me ask you this. Do you think, because in my mind, I'm thinking, well, why would it be on all the time in older adults? And part of it makes me think, well, we're fighting sarcopenia as we're older. So maybe that's why it's on. Maybe it has a purpose to be on. Maybe it's responding to the fact that we're losing muscle constantly. Am I missing something? So what
It's
are
a
your
good question.
Yeah.
The problem is it's on in multiple tissues, not just muscle. It seems that something that regulates mTOR's activity is getting dysfunctional as we get older. So it's in multiple tissues, not every tissue. They've looked in mice, but multiple tissues, it gets hyperactive. And particularly, it seems like it doesn't shut down during fasting when it should. But I would say you would think, I used to work with David Glass, who's done a lot of work on muscle, and he was like, you can't use a rapalog in a human because we're going to make them all have no muscle.
Right.
And then he did the experiment in older rats, which are one of the best models of sarcopenia. And to his surprise, he found the rats actually, some of the muscles, not all of them, but they get bigger when you give an old rat an mTOR inhibitor. And then there's also been really interesting data. Rats, as they get old, just kind of sit and they don't move. But in mice where they move, they actually have better motor function. They're able to run longer on a treadmill, hold on longer on a rod. So not just muscle size. And again, it's not all muscles. Some get bigger and some don't. But it's weird. You're giving an mTOR inhibitor and they're getting bigger muscle and better functioning muscle. And the neuromuscular junction gets better. So I think that the data would suggest whatever's going wrong in sarcopenia, turning down mTOR surprisingly is actually helping it rather than hurting it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are other implications to one of your earlier studies. Low dose mTOR inhibitors improve the immune response to influenza vaccination in older adults. Can you walk us through the I guess, sort of that study and what you think the mechanism behind that might be?
Sure. So when I left academics and I got eventually recruited to Novartis to a group called their New Indications Discovery Unit. And this was a really fun unit where they said, you need to figure out areas of medicine that fall between traditional big pharma silos. Like it's not GI, it's not neuro, it's not endocrine. And come up with new drugs for these new areas. And so the area I chose after sort of getting an aha moment from Cynthia Kenyon was to target aging biology. And because Novartis had a rapalog called everolimus, I'd use everolimus to test, can we make something better in an older adult by giving them a rapalog, an mTOR inhibitor. And when you do drug development, you want to quickly figure out in a short, not expensive trial, is your drug working or not? Because drug development costs, many, many millions of dollars, and you don't want to waste money on things that just aren't going to work. So I had to figure out what is something about aging that might be able to get better in a short period of time in a clinical trial. And I thought, well, the immune system, because we know when, for instance, you take a vaccine and 3 weeks later or 4 weeks later, your immune system is responding better to that antigen in the vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a paper published that was, a paper deserves a lot of credit from Northwestern showing if you gave old mice rapamycin, their response to a flu vaccination got better. So I said, let's just try this in a human. Let's see if we give a human an mTOR inhibitor, will their response to a flu vaccination get better? But Novartis actually sold this drug, everolimus, as an immunosuppressant. So I was like, I had to sell the company, I'm going to take your immunosuppressant drug and use it to enhance immune function in older adults. So a lot of people did not like this idea.
Yeah.
But fortunately, Mark Fishman and Dan Vasello was the CEO, and Mark Fishman was the head of R&D. They had decided the aging field had advanced enough that we ought to be doing something in this space, and they got it. And so what we decided to do was use very weird doses of this drug, much lower doses than the doses that suppress immune function, saying, if this is going to work, it can't be a dose that suppresses immune function. So we're going to use very low doses or intermittent doses that we don't think are going to suppress immune function and that we think will be safe. Because that was key for us. This had to be safe. Because we didn't know it was going to have any good effect, but we just didn't want to hurt any of these older volunteers. So we used very low daily doses or these once weekly intermittent doses. And these doses were predicted to just turn down mTOR, not turn it off. And turning off mTOR is what leads to the immunosuppression.
So one question I have, and looking back at med school, obviously you talk about rapamycin. I mean, usually my first exposure to that was on the transplant units, anti-rejection drugs. I think a lot of people have that perception of these types of mTOR inhibitors in general. And so at higher dose, what are they doing to the immune system that we use them for anti-rejection, basically to suppress the immune system in the first place?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are main things that they do. They stop T cell proliferation induced by a cytokine called IL-2, and they also induce regulatory T cells that induce tolerance to the graft. But it's really interesting because it's also been shown they suppress the immune response to alloantigens, which are the antigens in a foreign tissue that you engraft when you do an organ transplant. But they don't suppress the response to infectious pathogens.
Oh, really?
That's been shown in monkeys. It's a very different it's like a selective immunosuppression to some antigens and not others. So it's complicated. I don't think there's so many effects of mTOR inhibition on different immune cells, and it depends on the dose and the immune cell. So it's more complicated than just T cells, but that Treg upregulation and then effector T cell downregulation is part of the efficacy.
I guess so then on the counter of that, when you're using really low doses, what is it do you think that was actually enhancing the effect of the vaccine? Was it, I mean, I think about, the aging immune system, and I think about immunosenescence, maybe senescent immune cells, maybe cleaning that up. What's your thought on why the help?
Yeah, another great question. In the mice, what they showed is hematopoietic stem cells, which had hyperactive mTOR. This is a common theme in the organ systems where you see benefits. They had hyperactive mTOR. You use rapamycin, you suppress that hyperactive mTOR. They're able to make more naive T cells that were able to, and B cells that responded to the flu vaccine. It was interesting. In humans, we didn't see any increase in naive T cell or B cell production. What we saw was less T cell exhaustion, fewer PD-1 positive CD8 and CD4 T cells. It may have been too, mTOR inhibitors induce something called autophagy, and that's where you break down proteins that are dysfunctional and recycle them. But autophagy also may be involved in antigen presentation by dendritic cells and macrophages. We never knew was some of this due to better antigen presentation. So we don't know exactly what the mechanism was, but in 2 separate studies, we showed that enhanced response to a flu vaccine.
So you later had a series of trials using, I believe, one of these TORC1 inhibitors, RTB101, and basically it was designed, I guess, to boost antiviral immunity in older adults. Maybe you could tell us again, I mean, is there anything special about RTB101 other than it just being specific to TORC1?
Yeah, so when we did these 2 vaccine trials, it was just sort of a proof of concept to say, can you make something about aging organ systems work better? So the proof of concept we did, we said, you know what, we can make you respond better to a vaccine. But in real life, you're not going to use a drug like a Rapalog to give to everyone before they get their flu vaccine for many reasons, including you need to be incredibly safe for a vaccine because you're preventing diseases in people who don't have any disease. So it was like, okay, something's getting better about the immune system, but we're not going to develop this as a flu vaccine adjuvant. So what else do we see happening? And we did non-hypothesis driven RNA-seq in all the patients who had gotten these low doses of Rapalog. And we just looked at what gene expression changes. And to our surprise, almost all the genes that were significantly upregulated in these older adults getting mTOR inhibitors, they weren't metabolic or autophagy, or they were antiviral genes. All the antiviral genes in older adults get more expressed. And this may be part of the reason they were responding better to the flu vaccine.
Yeah.
You always see this upregulation of antiviral immunity. And that's interesting because older adults have a deficiency in the ability to respond, to have this antiviral response to viruses as we get older. And that's one of the reasons COVID-19 is so bad in older adults, is this antiviral response goes down. So we thought maybe what would make sense is to say, okay, we're not going to treat just your immune response to one flu or 3 flu antigens. What if we can boost your response to all respiratory viruses because that's the most common infection that occurs in older adults. What if we give older adults a low doses of an mTOR inhibitor during winter cold and flu season? Will they have fewer respiratory tract infections, most of which are viral?
So
So
basically,
that
this is just this is a prophylactic agent
exactly,
where you're saying we know that these antiviral, the antiviral capacity of these older people is down. We typically will vaccinate them, but why not just help them with their own immune system, right?
exactly. It's like an
Interesting.
immunotherapy for
Yeah.
respiratory
But
tract infection.
would you still vaccinate? You would still vaccinate on top of
Absolutely.
that, obviously. Yeah.
But the problem is, we now have a flu vaccine, a COVID vaccine. Now we have an RSV vaccine, but there are hundreds of respiratory viruses. Most of them, the virus that causes most pneumonias in people over the age of 80 is rhinovirus. Well, and this was stated before COVID, so I don't know where COVID's going to fall in. Rhinovirus in young people is what causes the common cold. In older adults, it causes pneumonia. And there are hundreds of different, there is Delta and
Yeah.
Omicron and, a few serotypes of COVID. There are hundreds and hundreds of rhinovirus. So we can't make a vaccine because there's too many different strains circulating. So
Yeah.
if you could get a drug that enhanced the antiviral response independent of the virus for older adults, that could protect them from all sorts of different respiratory viruses. It isn't virus specific. And so it would just help you beyond a flu, a
Yeah.
COVID, and an RSV to protect you from these viruses.
Yeah, absolutely. So that study, it showed some reduced confirmed respiratory infections, but I guess the phase 3 didn't meet the primary endpoint.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that. Like, what did you glean from the results? Um, of
Yeah.
that?
So it was a tricky, no one's ever developed an immunotherapy to make the immune system of older adults work better. So we were going into uncharted territory, and the FDA said to us, hey, we're going to learn with you because we never did this. In the phase 2 trial, for an endpoint, they said you have to have patients with symptoms of a respiratory tract infection, and they have to have a positive nasopharyngeal swab showing they have a pathogen. With that endpoint, we showed that our drug could work, that it was that was significantly reducing the incidence of respiratory tract infections. And in that trial, we had people at particularly high risk of respiratory tract infections. So they either had to have asthma or diabetes or COPD or be over the age of 85 or smokers. And we found that only some of those groups responded well and some didn't. So in the phase 3, we eliminated the groups that didn't respond, which were smokers and COPD, and allowed anyone over the age of 65 to enroll. But then the FDA decided during the phase 3, we're going to change what we want as the endpoint. This was right before COVID, and they said no one in the real world gets a nasopharyngeal swab when they get a cold or a flu. So you're not allowed to have that in your endpoint. You just have to show you decrease symptoms because that's what patients care about. This became a very, very difficult endpoint because it was really tough to say, just based on symptoms, does this person have a respiratory tract infection? Do they have an allergy? Do they have a CHF exacerbation when they're coughing and short of breath? And so we didn't hit the endpoint, and the investigators told us people are coming in hitting your diagnostic criteria for a respiratory tract infection when they know they don't have one. So the design wasn't right. We learned you can't do this without a nasopharyngeal swab. And of course, post-COVID, I think the FDA now will say, yes, people can get in the real world, get a nasopharyngeal swab.
It seems sort of
But
strange to me that, I understand their point, but on the other hand, getting objective data
right,
just seems more important,
I know it
for
was
the efficacy.
frustrating.
Yeah.
But the good news is what we learned is we still weren't, even if we'd had lab confirmed respiratory tract infections, it wasn't right. If we looked, what and we also started to get more basic science data. What the mTOR inhibitors really seem to be doing is decreasing severity of infection rather than are you going to get infected? You probably have more asymptomatic infection, but what you're really doing is once you get infected, that's when that antiviral response turns on and you get less severe infection. So, lessons learned. You have to sort of build up your scar tissue in these new areas to kind of get smarter about what to do going forward in these new areas. And I think we have a much better understanding now than we did, and we had to kind of go through those trials to figure it out.
What are you working on right now?
So we're bringing these new mTOR inhibitors. I should also say that drug that we used for these respiratory tract infection trials wasn't a rapamycin analog. It was
RTB 101, that
it
one?
was a catalytic site inhibitor, a completely
Okay.
different kind of molecule
Okay.
that doesn't have the same validation as these rapalogs for extending lifespan. So Novartis had developed these new rapalogs, which are better drugs than we had at Restro Bio. And we're going to bring them forward first in just phase 1 trials to make sure they're safe, to make sure they get into the tissues that we expect them to get into, and then to go test them in a variety of aging-related conditions.
Is there any other class of drugs that you think, well, gosh, I'm focused on mTOR, but that other class there is kind of interesting to me as well, and I think there's real promise? I'm just curious because it just seems like the space, there's a lot of noise in it, and obviously you guys know that from being the scientists, but even physician enthusiasts of longevity like myself look at it and find and think, how is anybody going to, people are taking supplements and all that kind of thing. Is there, what's true, what's not true? Is there anything out there other than rapamycin that you think has, that comes to mind that you're excited about?
Well, first of all, I should say, here's my problem with the supplements and a lot of the things people are doing. All our trials were placebo controlled.
Yeah.
The placebo effect was huge, huge. Doesn't even mean it isn't real. But like in that phase 3 trial, so many people on placebo saying, I've never had so few respiratory tract infections. People said, I've never had this level of energy often on placebo. Their vision was better. Their hearing was better. The amount of benefit that people got, they perceived they had this benefit from placebo was remarkable. And I do think there is probably a real mind to body biology going on with placebo. So it's just when you give the supplement, if anything that's having a biologic effect also has side effects, if this is real, how do we know the risk benefit of that supplement is positive for the benefit? And how do you know if you just didn't take sugar pill or meditate or something, you wouldn't have the same benefit? So until I see placebo controlled data, I just am like, is that really where you want to? You don't know the risks. You don't know the real benefit. You don't know if this is all in your head. I have issues with that. But what the real science, there's probably a lot of really good things. I mean, this field is such a nascent field. There's probably so many good targets. It's just rapamycin. We've got that data set already. But the epigenetic reprogramming, that's farther away. We don't have, all the understanding of what kind of drugs could we use, what's the safety profile. But that biology doesn't just delay aging, it reverses aging. And so I think that's incredibly exciting. It needs to be cracked, but I think that's a great, great area of science to get translated.
What do you think about, I'm just sort of wanted to get your thoughts on some bigger vision questions. And, Do you think that there are some genes that eventually we will identify that will have a, handful of genes that will have a significant direct effect on longevity that you could target either through various CRISPR technologies or, any kind of other genetic targeting? I'm curious about that because, I was speaking to Charlie Brenner. I don't know if you know Charlie Brenner, and he's an NAD pathway guy and very, very smart.
Mhm.
Discovered that pathway, and he doesn't really. He's probably the biggest skeptic on anything longevity there is. And I kind of posed the same question to him: is, what if we found a handful of genes that were okay? They're not ever going to be 100% responsible for what ages us, but what if we found something that was 20% responsible for aging us? Do you think that there is that kind of, because when you look at other species and like the whales, for example, that are living 400 or 500 years, and they have certain, duplicates and triplicates and quadruplicates of various types of genes that we don't have. I mean, is that kind of thinking interesting to you, or do you think it's kind of pie in the sky?
No,
Yeah.
I think we don't know. I
Yeah.
think all of this is possible. I know for mTOR, which again, I just know deeply, you need mTOR to grow and reproduce. It's more like a car. Like your car needs its engine, but as you get older, the engine needs tuning. It gets out of whack. And so you have to tune that essential part of the car. And I think a lot of aging may be, it's not, well, obviously you could have disease inducing, I'm sure there's some aging inducing drugs, but I mean, genes. But I think sometimes it's not the genes, maybe, or maybe it's genes that regulate
Yeah.
things like
Well,
mTOR.
like, for example, let's take mTOR.
Mhm.
How is mTOR different in whales that live 400 years? I mean, what is it? Is there, or is there things that are different in species that live a lot longer than us?
It's so when I was at Novartis, we did a whole thing of looking at the genes of long-lived birds, short-lived birds, long-lived rodents, short-lived rodents, and try to figure out what is exactly your question. What are the genetic differences in the long-lived as opposed to the short-lived species? And it was really complicated, and we
Yeah.
didn't come up with an answer. And there was, just massive amounts of differences and genes that we didn't know what they did. But doesn't mean that there isn't something there and more work
Uh,
doesn't need to be done. We didn't get to the answer, but with better AI and
Yeah.
machine learning, someone's probably going to be able to get there.
One last question. If you had unlimited funding and regulatory freedom, you could do anything you want. What study would you launch tomorrow to move the field forward?
But again, I'm so mTOR. There's so many experiments that could be done either in humans in different aging related diseases with mTOR inhibitors or even in preclinical species. We haven't even, for this one class of drugs, we haven't cracked the surface of, the dose, the duration, the tissues that you need to target and don't need to target. There is so much that I would love to do if I had unlimited funding. I would love to. There's so many human diseases that I would love to
Yeah.
test mTOR inhibitors in, and especially our TORC1 inhibitors, but you never have all those
Yeah.
resources.
Yeah. Where can we learn about your work? How do people follow what you're doing?
You can we have a website, Tornado Therapeutics. We're still a little bit in stealth mode, so there's not much to say yet. But, we'll try to get some interesting stuff
Yeah.
out there soon so
Yeah.
that people have something to look
Yeah.
at.
Thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it.
You bet.
Thanks for listening. A quick reminder that while I am, in fact, a surgeon, nothing I say should be construed as medical advice. Now, make sure to include your physician in any medical decisions you make. And also, if you're enjoying the show, please make sure to show your support with a like, share, or subscribe.